The most influential presidents had clear goals, strong platforms, and more often than not, a willingness to work with their political and military rivals to reach peaceful compromise. There is no doubt that those on the list of least influential presidents strive to emulate their fellow better presidents, but as we shall see, a number of situational and behavioral issues kept their administrations from reaching any great historic heights. Some of these presidents, like William Henry Harrison, died in office rather soon after election, so any chance of a legacy was cut short before it really began. Let us now examine those presidents who didn't make the grade and what exactly landed them at the bottom of the barrel. William Henry Harrison was the last president to be born before the Declaration of Independence and was also the first to die while still in office, and effectively serving the shortest term at 32 days as president. The shortest-serving president apparently had the longest inaugural address in history, taking 2 hours to read, even though its 8,445 words had been edited down from a much longer manuscript by friend and fellow Whig Daniel Webster. In an effort to prove his virility, Harrison rode a horse in his inaugural parade and wore no coat or hat despite the rainy, wet conditions of the day. It was assumed that this is what caused the cold and later the pneumonia that killed him, but that wouldn't occur for 3 more weeks. Harrison died on April 4th, 1841, placing the American government into an awkward position. At the time, there was no clear contingency plan in place for the death of the president. While Article II named the vice president as successor, scholars and legislators at the time argued over whether that named Tyler the president or merely acting president, and the Constitution did not specify whether the vice president was to serve the remainder of the president's term. Both houses of Congress debated, but eventually named Tyler President of the United States.
A sense of what is due to the legislative will denies me the privilege of giving longer audience to the suggestion of my feelings. That voice which called me to the Chief Magistracy now makes upon me a new demand. I have opposed to it my wishes and inclinations up to that point when acquiescence becomes a duty, and resistance would be censurable by all. I shall then, in due season, accept the appointment with which I have been honored.
While Tyler may have had his nation's interest in mind when he served as president to the Whig Party, it became increasingly clear that Tyler was not going to walk the party line in a way that was expected of his late successor. He clashed with Whigs when it came to the National Bank Act. Whigs favored a new act in response to the Panic of 1837, which Tyler twice vetoed. In September of 1841, Tyler's entire cabinet, except for Daniel Webster, Secretary of State, resigned, hoping to force Tyler into resignation as well. When it became clear that Tyler wouldn't budge, the Whigs expelled John Tyler from their party. Later, the Whigs in the House of Representatives began impeachment proceedings against Tyler. Up until that time, a president rarely vetoed legislation. Tyler saw himself fighting his own party at nearly every legislative turn. In August of 1842, a vote of 98 to 90 from the House of Representatives endorsed a plan to impeach President Tyler, but because of the two-thirds clause, Tyler was never successfully impeached. Though Tyler escaped impeachment, the next election proved to be Tyler's undoing. Already, certain of his defeat months before the election even began, Tyler's campaign ran on the Tyler and Texas platform in reference to his attempt to annex the land Mexico had surrendered. After the presidency, Tyler retired to a plantation in Virginia. At the outbreak of the Civil War, Tyler sided with the Confederacy and was elected delegate to the Provisional Confederate Congress, but he passed away on January 12, 1862, before he could serve his term. Zachary Taylor, a veteran of both the War of 1812 and the just-ended Mexican-American War, wanted little to do with politics, preferring a military career. However, in the 1848 election, the Whig Party convinced Taylor to run for office. Taylor reluctantly agreed, and in spite of a muddled platform, he was named our 12th president. His transition into office was a long process. He did not resign his command until late January of 1849, and then spent many months choosing his cabinet. His inauguration was held Monday, March 5th of that year, and in the summer, Taylor embarked on a tour of the northeastern portion of the United States in order to familiarize himself with the people, the politics, and problems in that region. Much of this trip saw Taylor beset with gastrointestinal illness, and by the summer of the following year, Taylor fell ill again with an unknown ailment and died suddenly on July 9, 1850, at age 65. The death is blamed on the consumption of raw fruit that may have been spoiled, but conspiracy theories stated that the president might have been poisoned by pro-slavery Southerners. A report made by scientists and historians in 2010 contends that there is no evidence for or against this theory. His short term in office and his indecisiveness when assuming the duties of president have landed him on this list of least effective and least influential presidents. Taking office to become the 13th President of the United States was Millard Fillmore, Taylor's vice president and fellow Whig. Fillmore's 3-year term was mostly of note for the passage of the Compromise of 1850. The Compromise of 1850 was a packet of 5 bills that attempted to resolve issues arising from the newly acquired territories as a result of the Mexican-American War. President Zachary Taylor had lived to see the inception of these bills, and it fell to Fillmore to see them through. Anti-slavery lawmakers, like Taylor, wanted California to be admitted as a free state, while pro-slavery legislators naturally favored slavery and slave trade in the new territories. While the Compromise admitted California as a free state and abolished the slave trade, but not slavery, in the District of Columbia, Fillmore signed the Compromise due to the improvements to the Fugitive Slave Act, which granted federal officers to slaveholders seeking escapees. The passage of these acts seemed to continue Taylor's goals and served to bitterly divide the Whig Party.
My administration will not be deterred by any timid forebodings of evil from expansion. Indeed, it is not to be disguised that our attitude as a nation and our position in the globe render the acquisition of certain possessions not within our jurisdiction eminently important for our protection.
Described as a doughface, or a Northern citizen with Southern sympathies in the argument over slavery, Pierce is sometimes noted as one of the worst presidents in United States history. He seemed ill-equipped to manage a changing nation and seemed to fail to recognize the damage that the rift of slavery was causing. His cabinet was filled with men whose opinions and policy practices differed wildly. And while many saw his appointments as in error, Pierce's cabinet is the only one to remain the same throughout his term in office. The only major legislation signed by Pierce was the Kansas-Nebraska Act. defining those territories and granting those territories the right to decide by popular vote whether or not to allow slavery. The act effectively repealed the Missouri Compromise, which stated that no new states admitted above the 36th North parallel would be slave states. The act saw the country divide even further over the slavery issue and led to bloodshed, like the actions in what came to be known as Bleeding Kansas, where John Brown and his sons murdered pro-slavery activists in 1856. The country was pointed more than ever toward civil war, and Franklin Pierce, too, lost his candidacy for a second term. James Buchanan took office as the United States' 15th president on March 4, 1857. Like his predecessor, Buchanan was called a doughface, or a Northerner with sympathies toward the slave-owning South. He had served as a senator from Pennsylvania, as well as in the House of Representatives. Buchanan served as Secretary of State under James K. Polk and Minister to the United Kingdom under Franklin Pierce. A lawyer with a huge political background and the motto, "I acknowledge no master but the law," Buchanan, too, seemed ill-equipped to effectively lead a quickly dividing nation. In his inaugural speech, Buchanan promised not to run for a second term, but the point was moot by the end of his time in office. The split caused in the Democrats caused a Republican plurality in Congress in the election of 1858 and blocked most of the Buchanan-backed legislation. He was almost impeached when his administration came under investigation for buying votes from Republican representatives. Any effort Buchanan made to unite the bitter factions of the North and South only served to alienate both sides, and under Buchanan's administration, more and more Southern states seceded from the Union, drawing the battle lines for the Civil War. This failure to bring diplomacy has landed James Buchanan on the list of worst United States presidents. As the nation mourned fallen President Abraham Lincoln and the American Civil War drew to a close, Lincoln's vice president, Andrew Johnson, assumed the office as the 17th President of the United States. During Lincoln's first term and in the midst of Civil War, the president named Johnson the military governor of Tennessee after the Union had retaken the state. When Lincoln ran for a second term, the war Democrat and Southern Unionist Andrew Johnson seemed like a natural choice for his running mate. In March of 1865, Lincoln and Johnson were sworn in as president and vice president, respectively, and the latter was reported to have given an inaugural speech while drunk. After Lincoln's assassination made him president 6 weeks later, it became clear that Johnson's goals as president were at odds with that of Congress and that of a nation trying to rebuild and unify. Johnson opposed the 14th Amendment, which granted citizenship to African American males, offered no protection to the former slaves during Reconstruction, and constantly overruled Congress when they refused to pass laws by representatives from states that passed black codes or laws that were put into place to deny freed slaves their civil liberties. Because of Johnson's outspoken criticism of Southern secessionists before his term as president, Congress naturally thought Johnson was the right man to unify the country. His actions while president, however, ran counter to his earlier stance. In 1868, impeachment proceedings against Johnson began, with 11 articles against the president, including the dismissal and invalid appointment of men into the Secretary of War office, conspiring to unlawfully seize full control of that office, and making speeches with intent to show disrespect for Congress. Johnson was the first sitting president to be impeached, and the last until Bill Clinton 131 years later. Like Clinton, Johnson was acquitted of all charges, but his reputation was forever damaged. He lost the nomination for president in the next election, and while he did become the only former president to serve in the Senate, Andrew Johnson's stance against federal rights for freed slaves has historians calling him one of the worst presidents.
It became patent to my mind early in the rebellion that the North and South could never live at peace with each other except as one nation, and that without slavery. As anxious as I am to see peace established, I would not, therefore, be willing to see any settlement until this question is forever settled.
Ulysses S. Grant was easily elected president in 1868, and as president continued what he saw as his mission held over from his successful campaign as general during the Civil War: the eradication of any remaining Confederate nationalism and any facets of slavery. The general was relentless in this goal, passing the Force Acts to prosecute and jail members of the Ku Klux Klan and effectively disbanding that organization. While his work for peace, both foreign and domestic, remains a fine accomplishment, Grant struggled with financial issues and corruption throughout much of his time in office. His response to the financial panic of 1873, which brought about economic depression in Europe and the United States, brought less than stellar results. In fact, the panic was known as the First Great Depression until the stock market crash of 1929 and the ensuing years of depression. Grant's bailouts to banking institutions in New York were a quick fix, but ultimately led to 5 years of depression. Following the panic, Grant soon became the president that had to respond to congressional investigations of financial corruption of all departments of the federal government, the most out of any other United States president. His time in office helped to stabilize the country after the Civil War, but under Grant's failure to fight economic decline, it appeared that politics were a corrupt game played by immoral and unjust men. 29th President Warren G. Harding worked as an advocate for labor, minorities, and women, but he also has the dubious distinction of being involved in one of the first major political scandals and established a new normalcy of corruption and cronyism in politics. When elected, Harding selected the so-called best minds for his cabinet, but rewarded his campaign contributors and friends with powerful positions. Known as the Ohio Gang, this group orchestrated the infamous Teapot Dome scandal, whereby Harding's Secretary of the Interior, Albert B. Fall, was convicted of accepting bribes from private oil companies in a deal that leased Navy oil reserves to private companies at seemingly low rates and without any bidding from other companies. Harding died suddenly on August 2, 1923, cutting his one term short. Speculation abounded. One theory, that Harding's own wife poisoned him due to the rumored affairs with other women that Harding was known for. Harding's widow, Florence, quickly returned to Washington to burn or hide away Harding's papers and personal correspondence in an effort to protect his legacy. However, the corruption and scandal that was exposed after his death has ranked Harding among the worst American presidents.
Tonight I shall present to the Congress 6 great goals. I shall ask not simply for more new programs in the old framework. I shall ask to change the framework of government itself, to reform the entire structure of American government so we can make it again fully responsive to the needs and the wishes of the American people. If we act boldly, if we seize this moment and achieve these goals, we can close the gap between promise and performance in American government. We can bring together the resources of this nation and the spirit of the American people.
Then there's Richard Milhous Nixon. The 37th President of the United States may fit in on either list of most or least influential presidents. As a diplomat, he opened trade relations with China and eased tensions with Soviet Russia. At home, in the United States, he started a war on drugs initiative that, unlike the present-day drug enforcement measures, focused on education and rehabilitation rather than simple incarceration. But as we shall also see, Nixon's second term became the one that defined his presidency in the eyes of many Americans. One that, to some, reflected all the pettiness and paranoia of the Cold War and the corruption of political power. Initially, Nixon continued to escalate American involvement in Vietnam, but by 1973, it was clear that U.S. troops needed to be withdrawn as the North Vietnamese army overtook the Republic of Vietnam. However, during his presidency, Nixon was responsible for ending a Cold War stalemate by opening diplomatic and trade relations with the People's Republic of China in 1972, and signed the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty with the Soviet Union that very same year. In America, Nixon generally favored federal policy that returned governing and legislative power to the states, took initiative to fight cancer and illegal drugs, put into place environmental reforms, and enforced the desegregation of public schools. When he was re-elected in 1972, the centerpiece of Nixon's second term in office became the president's involvement in the Watergate scandal. On June 17, 1972, 5 men were arrested for breaking into the Democratic National Committee headquarters located in the Watergate office complex in Washington. The men were holding cash that the FBI later traced to a slush fund used by Nixon's committee for the re-election of the president. The arrests soon unleashed a tide of unsavory information as illegal practices such as burglary and wiretaps were found to have been perpetrated against the Democratic Party by Nixon's aides and advisors. The attempts at a cover-up of the shady operations only damned the president further. Several of Nixon's top aides were tried and jailed, and as it looked inevitable that the House of Representatives would vote to impeach the president, and just as strong a possibility was in the Senate, Richard Nixon resigned from the office of the president on August 9, 1974. He remains the only American president to resign his post. Whatever Nixon's intentions, his actions have contributed to a distrust and overall negative view of the commander-in-chief, even while his earlier term proved him an able diplomat and a statesman. It's easy to see why, as a president, historians continue to debate just on what list Nixon should be placed, among the best or among the worst. As historians continue to examine the effectiveness of the United States past and future commanders-in-chief, who will make the grade and who will receive poor marks? Will a re-examination in 50 or 100 years shift one president from the most effective to the least effective category? How will historians rank our more recent presidential administrations, from politics to power.
Thanks for watching. If you'd like to help us produce more compelling historical content like this, please like, comment below, and share this video with fellow history buffs. And of course, be sure to subscribe to help keep history happening.